There is a number that does not appear in any movie about the Battle of Midway. It does not appear in most books about the Battle of Midway either, because it is not a dramatic number. It does not belong to an admiral or a dive bomber or a codebreaker. It belongs to the 1,400 men who spent 72 consecutive hours in a dry dock at Pearl Harbor, doing skilled manual labor on a damaged aircraft carrier that the Japanese Empire had already officially declared sunk. That number, 1,400 workers, 72 hours, is the number that made the Battle of Midway possible. Everything else that happened on June 4, 1942, the code breaking, the dive bombing, the 6 minutes that destroyed 3 Japanese fleet carriers in sequence, was downstream of what those 1,400 men accomplished in that dry dock. The Yorktown did not survive the Battle of the Coral Sea on luck. She did not arrive at Midway on luck. She arrived because of a decision made by Admiral Chester Nimitz that reflected a fundamentally different understanding of industrial warfare than the one operating on the other side of the Pacific. And the difference between those two understandings is the story that the romanticized history of Midway consistently fails to tell. Let's go back to May 27, 1942. The Yorktown limps into Pearl Harbor after absorbing serious damage at the Coral Sea. One direct bomb hit that penetrated 4 decks, structural damage from near-miss pressure waves, ruptured internal systems. The engineering survey is completed, and the assessment delivered to Nimitz is 90 days minimum for full restoration to operational standard. This is not an inflated estimate. The damage is real. The structural repairs required to bring the ship back to peacetime specification involve pulling damaged frames, replacing compromised bulkheads, restoring ruptured fuel and water systems in the proper sequence that naval engineering doctrine requires. 90 days is what the manual calls for. Nimitz does not accept the 90-day estimate, not because he is reckless, but because he is asking a different question than the one his engineers answered. His engineers answered the question of how long full restoration takes. Nimitz wants to know how long minimum viable operational capability takes. He needs a ship that can launch and recover aircraft in combat conditions. He does not need a ship that passes every system certification in the naval engineering checklist. The distinction matters enormously. Treating those two questions as the same question is what produces 90-day estimates. Treating them as different questions is what produces 72-hour turnarounds. This is the operational philosophy that separated American carrier warfare logistics from Japanese carrier warfare logistics in 1942, and it was not an accident. It reflected a doctrine of repair and damage control that the United States Navy had been developing systematically, and that the Imperial Japanese Navy had not. American damage control doctrine in 1942 was formalized, trained, and drilled to a degree that surprised Japanese officers who later examined it in captured documents and prisoner interrogations. Every American carrier crew trained extensively on flooding control, fire suppression, and structural emergency repair. The Yorktown's crew had practiced the procedures that kept her afloat at Coral Sea for years before they ever needed them in combat. That training did not appear in any Japanese threat assessment of the Yorktown's resilience. When the repair work began on May 27th, the approach was systematic triage. Compartments that could not be rapidly restored were isolated. The flooding damage was addressed to the minimum standard required for seakeeping at operational speeds. Structural repairs were made with the understanding that they were temporary, sufficient for the ship's immediate mission, not for long-term service life. The flight deck and aviation fuel systems received priority over everything else. 1,400 workers operated in overlapping shifts without interruption. The dry dock at Pearl Harbor was illuminated through the night. By any normal operational tempo, what was accomplished in those 72 hours was not supposed to be possible. It was possible because the workforce, the tooling, and the organizational capacity to execute that kind of repair tempo existed at Pearl Harbor in May 1942. Not because of some spontaneous surge of effort, but because American industrial mobilization had been building that capacity for months, and the Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard had been the subject of deliberate expansion since 1940. Japanese naval intelligence had no model for this. The Japanese carrier repair timeline was calibrated against Japanese industrial capacity and Japanese workforce organization, which was genuinely capable, but operated at a different scale and with different doctrine than what Nimitz had available. When Japanese analysts assessed the Yorktown's damage from Coral Sea and concluded she was either sunk or out of action for months, they were not being negligent. They were extrapolating from their own experience. It never occurred to them to ask whether the Americans could repair a fleet carrier in 3 days, because the Japanese Navy could not repair a fleet carrier in 3 days. This is the most dangerous form of intelligence failure. Not missing data, but filtering the data you have through assumptions that prevent you from seeing what the enemy is actually capable of. The Yorktown left Pearl Harbor on May 30th, with repair crews still working in her interior. She joined Enterprise and Hornet northeast of Midway on June 2nd, constituting Task Force 17 under Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher. Her presence was invisible to Japanese intelligence. Tokyo's operational picture showed 2 American carriers in the Central Pacific. The Yorktown did not exist in that picture. She had been sunk. This was not a minor error in Japanese force assessment. It was a structural mistake that distorted every decision Nagumo made on the morning of June 4th, from the distribution of his combat air patrol, to the sequencing of his strike preparations, to his response when American aircraft began appearing from directions his fighter direction had not anticipated. The battle unfolded in the way that has been told and retold, and the main outlines are accurate. American codebreakers had given Nimitz the Japanese order of battle and the likely date and direction of attack. American dive bombers, operating from all 3 carriers, caught the Japanese fleet at a catastrophic moment. Carriers in the process of rearming aircraft on deck, ordnance stacked in the open, fuel lines exposed. The strikes on Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu in the space of 6 minutes were the result of timing, navigation errors that accidentally synchronized multiple attacks, and the vulnerability created by the rearming process. The historical analysis of those 6 minutes is sound, but the analysis typically treats the 3-carrier American force as a given, a baseline from which the tactical events unfolded. The Yorktown's presence made the 3-carrier force possible. Her air group's attacks created coordination problems for the Japanese combat air patrol that a 2-carrier attack would not have created to the same degree. Her contribution to the strike that found and hit Hiryu, the 4th Japanese carrier, which survived the initial attack long enough to strike back at the Yorktown, was direct. The Japanese counterattack on the Yorktown is where the narrative typically frames what happened as tragedy or near disaster. Hiryu's aircraft found the Yorktown and hit her with 2 bombs and then 2 torpedoes. She listed severely. Her captain ordered abandoned ship. The Japanese scout reporting back to Nagumo confirmed the carrier's destruction. The intelligence picture in Nagumo's operations room showed that the American carrier threat had been neutralized. Japanese command believed they had struck a 2nd carrier in the 2nd attack, that 2 different American ships had been hit. The reality was that they had struck the same ship twice. The Yorktown, already carrying the internal evidence of Coral Sea damage in her sealed compartments and temporary structural repairs, had absorbed a 2nd major attack and was still structurally present enough to be mistaken for a fresh target. The decision to reboard the Yorktown and assess salvage potential is operationally significant and historically underexamined. It was not automatic. The ship had been abandoned. A combat area with an active submarine threat is not a favorable environment for reboarding a damaged listing carrier. The decision reflected a damage control philosophy that treated salvage as a default option rather than an exceptional one. American damage control doctrine said, assess first, abandon as a last resort, reboard if conditions permit. The men who went back onto the Yorktown were operating within a trained framework that told them the ship might be savable, and that a savable fleet carrier was worth the risk of the attempt. They were right about the ship and wrong about the submarine. The I-168 found the Yorktown under tow on June 6th and put her down for good. Her loss mattered. 141 men from the Yorktown and the destroyer Hammond died in the submarine attack. The ship that Nimitz had returned to operational status in 72 hours, that Tokyo had never counted in their order of battle, that had contributed to the destruction of Japan's 4 fleet carriers at Midway. She was gone on June 7th, less than 10 days after leaving Pearl Harbor. The arithmetic of what she cost and what she contributed is not comfortable to reduce to a ledger. But the strategic arithmetic is clear. The 4 Japanese carriers she helped destroy at Midway represented the offensive core of the Pearl Harbor strike force. The pilots lost with those carriers, the irreplaceable veterans of years of combat experience, could not be replaced at the rate Japan's training pipeline permitted. The Battle of Midway ended Japan's capacity to project offensive carrier power in the Central Pacific. The United States, with its industrial base fully mobilized and its carrier construction program delivering new ships throughout 1943, replaced losses and expanded capacity simultaneously. Japan could replace neither ships nor pilots at an equivalent rate. This is the context in which the Yorktown's 72-hour repair is not a footnote, but a strategic data point. It demonstrated something about American industrial and organizational capacity that Japanese planning had systematically refused to account for. The ability to take a heavily damaged fleet carrier, triage her systems, mobilize 1,400 skilled workers, and return her to combat operations in 3 days was not an emergency improvisation. It was the product of deliberate investment in infrastructure, workforce training, and doctrinal development that the American Navy had been building since the late 1930s. The Japanese Navy, operating on the assumption that the Americans could not match their discipline and organizational efficiency, never modeled for this capability. Their order of battle at Midway was built on that assumption. Their tactical plan was built on that assumption. And when the Yorktown appeared on the horizon northeast of Midway, and her aircraft began launching on the morning of June 4th, that assumption collapsed. Not dramatically, not in a way that Nagumo's staff immediately understood. The assumption collapsed the way most strategic miscalculations collapse, quietly, in the gap between what the intelligence picture showed and what was actually in the water. The romanticized history of Midway tells you the battle was won by codebreakers and courage and 6 improbable minutes of dive bombing. All of that happened. But the reason those 6 minutes were possible is that Nimitz had 3 carriers in the water instead of 2. And the reason he had 3 was that he understood something about the relationship between industrial capacity and military power that his opponent had chosen not to model. The Yorktown was not a miracle. She was evidence. Evidence that the side doing the rigorous operational accounting, not the side with the more inspiring warrior philosophy, but the side counting the drydock hours and the repair crews and the flight deck certifications, was going to win a long war in the Pacific. The battle confirmed it. The drydock records at Pearl Harbor had already written the conclusion.